presentation with you. So Lucinda comes to us by background as one of us. She's an urban designer by background with a love of people and places. I had the pleasure of having a good chat with her just the other day. She and co-founder Jessica Christensen Franks are serial entrepreneurs. What a mix. Urban designers, entrepreneurs, perfect. Known for leading the global conversation on urban innovation for more than a decade. Since 2017, a small business themselves, they've grown to a staff of around 15 people. Neighborlytics has harnessed data to be meaningful for more than 1,000 neighbourhoods, 12 countries, and in 2019 was named Deloitte's Rising Star and Startup of the Year in the Australian Information Industry Association Awards. As I said, I had a chat with Lucinda a couple of days ago, and we spoke quite excitedly about this session. We've got the rules. We've talked a bit about the rules with Simon. Now we're talking about how data can be used to make better decisions in our places and for our people. Today, we've got around 200 people joining us from around Australia, the capital cities, a few international guests. Please feel free to wave at me excitedly if you are joining us. I know there's a couple. Ollie, hi. And there's someone from Singapore as well. Ollie, throw in the chat if you don't mind where you're from. That'd be great. Although the sun's up, so I don't expect you too far away. This session, we might chunk into a few parts. Lucinda's happy to take some questions. Pop them into the chat, or you know, feel free to message me privately. What if you're feeling shy? Although you're a town teamer, I doubt you are. Lucinda and I spoke about the importance of physical place in a digital context. But even more interestingly, Lucinda's joining us from lockdown in Preston, one of Victoria's hotspots. So cool, calm and collected. We've thrown everything at her today. And Lucinda, if you're ready, I will hand over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ling, Cully and the team. And it's really such a pleasure to be here today. I'm a huge fan of town teams and really do feel like a kindred spirit in lots of ways. I think the more local leadership, locally led projects that we have, this is how we're going to get through COVID. It's how we're going to rebuild our cities post-COVID. So I'm in the north of Melbourne. I don't have my mask on just because I'm inside for a moment. I did have it on this morning. I'm just plugging in my battery, just making sure I've got everything here. And yeah, it's been a bit of a wild ride. I don't know if Ling, if you're able to share the slides and see if that works. What I'm really excited to talk to you about today is what we've been observing in the data throughout COVID. So I'm from Neighborlytics, and if you just jump quickly to the second slide there, Ling, we create on-demand digital data for neighbourhoods. So how did an urban designer passionate about community-led placemaking end up in a data analytics company? No, I'm not the bad guy. The quest that we are on and that I want to share with you today is that we really need better data and better information about the things that matter about cities. We are working towards a world where we have more and more data-led decision-making, but the data that we have at our fingertips tends to be about traffic flows, about building heights, about the balcony depth. It tends to not be about the things that really matter to our social connection, to our local economies. And filling in that data gap is really why we're here. So if you go to the next slide, as Lynn mentioned, I'm from Preston. And this is a slide from Preston Market last week. This breaks my heart in so many ways. Local open air markets, I'm so fortunate to live 5 minutes from one. As you would know, the absolute heartbeat and lifeblood of neighbourhoods, and that's certainly the case where I live. And while it is still sort of technically some stores are open, it's really suffering in lots of ways. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that you see a picture of that same place taken in February, pre-lockdown, which is what it's normally like. It's a hustle and thrive, very messy place. You know, we've found that overall, the City of Melbourne has found that their pedestrian volumes are down 83% during this time. We've seen massive shifts, and that's been really experienced everywhere. But in amongst that, if you go to the next slide, we find that there are pockets of social and economic resilience. And this is John. He's one of my favourite baristas because I'm from Melbourne, so I know my barista by name. And his cafe is around the corner from my house. And we see, and I'm sure you have seen, that here are people who were one day running a cafe and the next day they are running a takeaway business and a grocery store, two totally different business models, and they've pivoted in 48 hours. Now that is incredible, and that is what gives me hope that we are going to get through this time. But what is it about people like John that are able to do that and others that might not be able to? And how do we pick the trends and provide the best support for our local economies as we start to think about COVID recovery? So what are the things that will make local economies thrive in the new normal? We like to call it the new local, not the new normal. If you go to the next slide, if there's one thing that we've really learned is that there's a new economic geography emerging about our cities. Now, the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods, 15-minute neighbourhoods, walkable neighbourhoods is not new. Urban planners have been shouting about that for a decade. It's part of the Victorian urban planning policy. But what we have seen in the last few months is that become an everyday reality with everyone at home. And both the opportunity and the inequality that we see when there are some neighbourhoods where, yes, you can walk to services, parks, connection, you can have opportunities for local life, and others where that's incredibly difficult. And this is becoming the new challenge as we can reconceptualise what local walkable neighbourhoods look like. What that means, not just in terms of access to services and opportunity, but what that means in terms of local economy. So if you go to the next slide, you know, as someone who's worked a lot in placemaking, I've spent my career looking about how do we create great destinations. And I'm sure many of your work also explores those themes. Everything that we've put time and energy into is to how do we make places like Preston Market great? How do we get people to stay longer, to bring their friends, to come more days of the week? And it's all about creating this iconic destination quality that will attract people. The only thing is that doesn't work if one, people aren't traveling and moving around, and two, people can't get too close to each other and don't want to spend a long place. And we may be in this mode for a time, and certainly there'll be a time when that ends, but there are some fundamental shifts, particularly about people moving around less, which are likely to have a very long lasting impact. So what are the factors that are going to make neighbourhoods successful in the future? Well, if we look at the next slide, I just want to look at some examples of how this is playing out, how we're seeing this destination patterns pull out. Now, this is some of the Neighborlytics data that we've been looking at for cities across a municipality-wide data for some of our what we call launch cities, cities who are working with us on social wellbeing measurement across a period of time. And Moreland in inner Melbourne, also COVID hotspot, and Parramatta in Sydney, as you would know, another one. Now, these maps are showing where are the opportunities to spend and stay in those neighbourhoods based on the digital data. So where are people spending time? What are the opportunities for attractions? Now, what we see there is Parramatta, that yellow sort of hotspot down there is the Sydney Olympic Park. And it normally, in normal times, performs very well because it is a huge attractor. It's a great destination that attracts many, many people from many different types of activities. But the rest of the neighbourhood is not as diverse in terms of its attraction opportunity. If we look at somewhere like Moreland, what we actually see that it is much more diverse in its fabric of attractions. It doesn't have big stadiums, but it has lots of smaller things on every street, and that actually makes it more resilient when it comes to a COVID crisis. If we look at another example of where we've seen this localization pattern happening in the data, we're looking at the analysis of events and activities and how that influence our behavioural shifts. This is 2 data captures for central Sydney, one taken in January, one taken in April. Now, Sydney is normally an incredibly lively, busy place. 1,500 events in an average week or month is about the same as you would see in Brooklyn, in New York, or in Barcelona. It's really, really high, but right down to 126 in April. Now, it's not that activity is completely left, but it has been pushed out and shifted to the suburbs. So what we're seeing in post-COVID neighborhoods is people are no longer aggregating around big, large centers, but instead they are aggregating and spending time locally in local neighborhoods. And the success factors for those local neighborhoods are less about having the great destinations, but much more around people's level of attachment and engagement with those places. Are these places people love and feel connected to? That is the overriding driver that is helping local businesses and local communities get through this. If we think about, if just one next slide, if we go back to the example of John, which is somewhere that I spend a lot of time. Now, this cafe has a long queue, socially distanced queue, and this was taken a few weeks ago. Otherwise, they'd all be wearing masks now and not be getting fined outside. Now, why has this cafe been able to attract this kind of audience and the cafe on the corner opposite has not been able to do that? Now, it's not just that they have better coffee, actually, because they both have really good coffee. It's because they have a huge digital following that they have over the last few years put time and energy into engaging their community, not just face-to-face, but engaging their online community and building that online presence. So when they flip their menu, when they change to a takeaway store, they immediately have thousands of people that they can reach out to and shout out and tell them to come and to restore and be part of this business. So that's a level of digital engagement that's actually driving on the ground place attachment through COVID. Let's go to the next slide. So how do we use this? Can we make data-driven decisions right now? It's a time of huge uncertainty. And that's the second question that I kind of wanted to throw out today. If we look at traditional measures, you know, we are using more and more data. We might think, okay, well, how do we measure great attractions? We might want to look at things, if you just go to the next slide, like footfall. You know, footfall has really proven to be a great measure of success for businesses. We can also look at spend data, like how much credit card information have people got. But this is really challenging in an environment where people are now not necessarily spending, and they're definitely not spending a lot of time in places. So we need to be looking at different metrics of success. And I thought I might just throw it over to you for a moment in the next slide. And I'm going to try and get the chat because I'm connected through my iPad, about what do you think is going to be, what are the ways that we should be measuring performance during, post, and future neighbourhood? What are the things that we should be looking for? And I'd encourage you to put that in the chat.
Okay, great. Lucinda, so this is the first pause in the presentation, and we've got about 10 minutes left. In terms of the chat, I can't see it at the minute. So, Lucinda, can you see that?
Volunteer activity, community interactions, happiness factor, social interactions. Awesome. So if we just go to next slide, I agree. All of those things are incredibly important. The challenge is measuring that human stuff, technical term, is pretty hard. It's pretty hard, especially when we think about traditional data collection, like surveys, observations. One of the big challenges with surveys is you can only ever get the answers to the questions that you thought to ask. And observations can be really useful, but there's an inherent bias in every data, but it's also, you can't be everywhere. It's very difficult to measure change over the time. But if we go to the next slide, at the same time, cities are incredibly rich sources of digital data that, you know, every time we like, check in, tweet, post, like we're showing the world what's important to us and contributing to this very, very rich and diverse pool of data that describes everyday experience, connection, and social life. This data isn't necessarily new. The way that we interact with our environment digitally has been sort of building over time, and groups like the MIT Human Dynamics Lab at MIT, obviously, have been really stress testing and doing a lot of research on this data. They found that it's actually up to 5 times more accurate than demographic data when it comes to understanding things like behaviour. So not opinion, behaviour. And an example of that is, like, if you ask me in a survey how often I go to the gym, I'm very likely to tell you what I want you to think about me or what I want to think about myself rather than what I actually do. We're actually not very good at our self-assessment of our own behaviour. But at the same time, like my cell phone location is going to show that I go, maybe once a week, not the 3 or 4 times I put in the survey. So we can actually use location to get very accurate information about behavioural dynamics. So what Neighborlytics does, if we go to the next slide, is harnesses 10 to 15 sources of this very rich digital information, compress that down into a standardized data set that we create, which we're then able to do geospatial analysis on, but also more importantly, align it to key measures of the social performance of neighborhoods that we want to see. Becomes an evidence base for metrics that we understand. And then we can visualize that and track it over time to understand place performance and how it's moving dynamically. So there's three sort of types of data, and I'm just going to explain this and then jump into a couple of case studies because I know we're running short of time. There's 3 types of data that we look at. One is what you might call livability data. So what does the actual place data have? So sources like Google Maps, we think of that as being kind of, like an atlas for the world, but it's in fact a crowdsourced map. It's created by people's smartphones. If you use Google Traffic, that comes from smartphones. If you look at the opening hours of something like Bunnings on the weekend and it has the bar chart of how busy it is, that comes from aggregated cell phone data. This is information that's passively created about what's happening in places. On top of one of the big limitations of most of the ways that we have used data to inform city decision making to date is that it's very static and it focuses on our physical environment only. What we really need to understand is how that is interrelated with its social environment. So to do that, we look at information about activities and events and about chatter, what people are saying. So this gives us a flavour of what's there, what's happening, and what people value. Now, what we can do with that, because I know that there's been some talk in the chat around how do we actually set the performance, or what is it that we're actually looking for. We can use this information to measure what we call social prosperity. So if we just jump to the next slide quickly, we're able to use this rich evidence base to define what is the economic, physical, and community prosperity of a neighbourhood using different dimensions. So there's 39 indicators and 13 different measures that we look at in this framework to look at, how well a community meets daily needs through the lens of the social determinants of health. So I might just to highlight this because we're a little behind. I'm just going to give you some quick case studies and take questions at the end. That's okay. Because I'm sure usually when we talk about digital data, it naturally raises a lot of different questions for people. So what are we observing? I just want to give 3 quick examples of some of the trends that we are observing by measuring cities digitally during this time. The first is understanding the behavioural shift in public space. Now, if you've been in any kind of lockdown period, one place that we know that will be thriving is public spaces if you're still allowed out for exercise. And so when we look at that somewhere like Sydney, if you go to the next slide, we've been able to look at the activity in public spaces over time. So by looking at what people choose to opt into about their public spaces, we know very, very high levels of engagement with parks as opposed to other activities like families, sports, hobbies, craft work. And we've seen a huge increase in level of engagement and participation in parks during the pandemic. So this data was taken in April, where we found that parks and other natural spaces was really hugely up on an average for that part of town. The second thing is that we can start to measure in terms of main streets and local businesses. How do we really support main streets to be successful? Well, we really need to understand more about the diversity of those economic ecosystems and the engagement that people have with those local businesses, because that's what's going to drive success in a post-COVID economy. So if we look at coming back to again, and I've used this example a few times again with John and his cafe, it's called 15 pounds. If you ever need a good coffee in Melbourne, very good. But if we just go to the next slide, we compare somewhere like Station Street in Fairfield with Lygon Street in Carlton, if you know these places. Slide 29, I think, Lynn. We can see that Station Street in Fairfield has a very, very diverse local ecosystem. There's lots of different types of businesses all together, and that's really fostering its attachment, as opposed to somewhere like Lygon Street is a great destination for tourists, but people who might go there once. It's not the people who will go there every single week and repeatedly build up that pattern over time. Lygon Street's been hugely successful as a destination that people go to, but it is massively hard hit by COVID because it's very dimensional. So we can use digital data to understand what the patterns and trends are and how diverse different business types are and the level of engagement with them, with different industries in those neighbourhoods. And the last example is how we can use this to understand patterns of social connection. Now, there's two broader sort of schools of thought around social connection, social bonding, and bonding capital and bridging capital. So how much time you spend with your friends and family versus how much time you spend with strangers. And we need both. Right now, perhaps we're doing none of them, or maybe we're only having more of the bonding capital with friends and family. So neighbourhoods can reinforce that. They need destinations. Just one last slide this will show. Places need destinations that are going to encourage people to connect with family and friends, but also to connect with strangers. And we can look at the data to understand which types of places exist in the neighbourhood that are likely to do both of those things and where the opportunities are. And certainly during COVID, what we can see is that the neighbourhoods that have both have more opportunities for both connecting with friends and family as well as with strangers, are performing better overall than those who might be skewed towards a destination which only has places for strangers, or a very local neighbourhood which doesn't encourage many other people to visit. So there's some of the really broad things that we're seeing in the data, and the big picture that we're really excited about is because digital data is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's global, that we actually have the opportunity to transform the way that we're measuring city performance and honing in on data that's going to give us information about the things that really matter and how our places are really performing. So I'll stop it there because it's been a lot to get through today, but I think we've got a very few minutes for some questions.